One thing you learn very quickly reporting on Massachusetts is that everything has a housing dimension. Transit? How densely do we build around train stations? Immigration? How do we balance the state's obligation to give shelter with a lack of available units? Health? Who lives near medical centers? What are the impacts of poorly maintained housing stock? Economics? Well, if you can't live here, it's really tough to work here. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Here with me in the podcast studio/bunker is Secretary of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, Ed Augustus. I talked with Augustus on this here podcast in September 2023, soon after he took on the post. We talked about shelter capacity, low vacancy rates, and changing patterns of work, all things that are still consuming discussion around housing in the Bay State. But now we need to add in some sharp elbows over transit-centered multifamily housing and, of course, the new Trump administration. Sorry about that. The federal government is a factor in basically all of these conversations, so let's jump right in. Secretary, great to have you back on.
Great to be with you again.
So let's do some plate setting, as we always do first. When we last talked, it was before we had sort of a strong, concrete sense of what the actual need was for housing in the state of Massachusetts. We had some loose estimates, but we didn't have a hard number. So framing this in the way that you're probably not going to like the most, how bad is it?
Well, it's a challenge, certainly a daunting challenge, but one that at least now we have a roadmap for. We know what number of units that we need to create, not only to take some of the pressure off the housing ecosystem, but really to create enough new units so that we can compete, so that some of the particularly young folks, the 25 to 36-year-old demographic that we're losing disproportionately to other states because of the affordability, primarily around housing. That's an age range when you're starting your career. Often you're looking to purchase your first home, maybe start your family, and the challenge of affordability. And now we have a statewide housing plan, the first one in the history of the state, that lays out the need for 20,000 new units of housing that need to be created over the next 10 years to meet some of the existing needs and also allow for growth and competitiveness.
There were a few things in that sort of housing diagnosis that were really interesting to me. And one of them is that it really breaks out why we need some additional units. And some of them are for kind of projected growth. But one thing that really struck me was we also just have been in this housing crunch for so long that there's overcrowding. There are people who are not being adequately housed now. So there's a need for new units to just keep up with what the demand even currently is.
No, that's exactly right. And I like to think of it as like life cycle housing, the kind of housing that you might have been looking for when you were graduating from college with a few friends, getting an apartment, to when you started settling down and starting a family, to the type of housing that once you're an empty nester and you're looking to age in place, are different. And we want to see people be able to make those transitions when they need to at different points in their life and have options available to them for a whole number of factors: the high interest rates, the high cost of construction materials, the lack of ability to build in many communities have conspired over these last few years to really make it difficult to build the housing that meet the needs. And so we've got folks who want to move on. They want to get out of that roommate situation. They want to get out of their parents' house. Maybe their parents want them out of the house. Or they want to downsize. Their spouse has passed away. They got a big 3-bedroom house that they're struggling to maintain. But there's no place in the community that they love where everything they know and count on being accessible to them has options that are appropriate for them. So we need to create some of these units to allow that natural kind of movement that happens as people go into different phases of their life.
So our conversation today is taking place under something of a national shadow of uncertainty. So let's tackle that first. We've seen a budding trade war going on between the U.S. and its, generally speaking, closest allies and biggest trading partners. President Donald Trump has announced, then paused, then announced and raised, and then paused, and at the moment is holding to an April 2nd date for tariffs, including what was a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, but will now be maybe 50% because of Canadian retaliatory surcharges targeting energy. Add in lumber tariffs, add in energy battles. Secretary, this doesn't seem, to put it mildly, great for predictability in the construction industry?
Yeah, no, that's That's putting it very mildly. Equity, which is often needed in order to advance. Most of the housing that's built in Massachusetts is done by the private sector. Even the housing that the Commonwealth subsidizes through our various programs is often done by private developers who are also accessing equity and capital to support those projects. And equity and capital, because they're being invested on behalf of a retirement fund or a college endowment, are looking for a particular return. And given all of the unpredictability about the cost of materials for housing, now the unpredictability about interest rates, we thought we were going to be going down this year. It doesn't look like we're going to be going down this year. So those things have added uncertainty, which often keeps equity and capital on the sidelines until they know that the project you're pitching them on, that you're looking for their equity investment in, is going to realize the kind of returns they need. If we don't know whether the price is going to be, 25% higher than the one you're talking about right now, that is, in many cases, from talking to developers, keeping projects kind of on the sideline until they see how this sorts out. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need. We need folks jumping in, moving these projects forward, investing in these projects, not sitting on the sidelines because of this kind of, unnecessary uncertainty and ambiguity that the Trump administration actions and changes, as you outlined, have introduced to an already challenging housing market.
And one thing that did come to mind when I was looking specifically around the steel tariffs was this kind of reminder, this deja vu about kind of mid-pandemic. We were seeing a lot of material shortages, a lot of labor shortages, and we really saw the market that was already kind of crawling along really stagnating. Is your fear that we would see something like that again, or that it would sort of hold where it is?
My fear right now is it's just slowing down. The demand is there, and that's only getting worse every week that a project doesn't move forward. At the state level, we're doing everything we can through some of the zoning changes that we've enacted, whether they be in the Affordable Homes Act around ADUs, through the MBTA Communities Act, or through some of the ideas that were put forward in the Unlocking Housing Production Commission to remove what the state and locals can control as it relates to predictability. Can you actually build, multifamily, more dense housing in communities? So we're working on that. These federal issues, again, the interest rate environment is challenging for any administration to work on, but these tariff conversations and driving up the cost of materials on top of already substantially higher costs post-pandemic, unnecessary variables that are being added in. And so, ultimately, hopefully these things settle out, but it's lost time. It is months and weeks that go by that projects might otherwise be able to move forward that are waiting for more clarity.
And as we dig in on some of these suggestions too, how would you suggest that we keep that national context in mind? Is this a caveat to all of these suggestions? We should do this, but bear in mind there is this unpredictability in the market. Like, how are these two things knitting together?
I think what we need to do is stay conscious of what's going on at the federal level, do what we can to raise concerns and make people aware, particularly our federal legislators, about what the consequences, may be unintended, but the consequences of some of these actions, or at least even discussions about these actions. But what we should not do is slow down at the state and local level on the things that we know we can and should be doing, like providing more kind of certitude around zoning. And, are there ways that the state can make our regulatory environment more conducive to housing production? We have tried to expand the state subsidies that we put in, whether it be expanding tax credits through the tax bill 2 years ago, or through the Affordable Homes Act and the increased authorization of spending for a lot of the subsidy programs that we use to support the creation of housing of all kinds, particularly affordable housing.
So I'm sure the federal side will flood back in, but let's reorient a little bit. The state's housing plan identifies not just the number of units that we need in the next decade, but a number of issues getting there. I think to start out, where do you see the single largest opportunity here for policy change? There are about 100 different puzzle pieces that we'll get into, but is there one really big lift that you're looking at as something that, regardless of the broader federal system, has the opportunity to unlock a lot of these units during that time frame?
We're getting close to opening day, so I'm going to torture a baseball metaphor here and say that I think there's a lot of singles, doubles, triples that we need to bring to fruition in order to ultimately win this housing game. And, there are a host of recommendations, a lot of which do rely on some changes to zoning, some of the ways that some of these decisions get made on the ground and the ways that the state can support local governments as they kind of sort through how to create a regulatory environment that, manages issues that they rightly are concerned about, but doesn't become a tool for preventing housing or preventing certain types of housing from being created in their community. And again, we're seeing some of this with the MBTA Communities Act. ADUs, I think, is an example of there was a patchwork of ordinances around the Commonwealth, some that communities that very much embraced ADUs and made it fairly easy, and others that virtually prohibited them. And now we have one set of statewide standards. It's as of right. There's still some local say, but a lot of the ambiguity and the patchwork has been removed. And that one policy change, I think, is going to unlock thousands of additional units that cost the state nothing. That's homeowners deciding that it makes sense for them to do it. It gently adds density in existing homes across the state. And it's one of the things that we need to do as part of a whole series of things that we need to do. So again, not necessarily grand slams and home runs, but a lot of small, medium, and larger policy changes and investments that collectively can really move the needle.
Right. So I'm glad that you brought up ADUs. We can kind of start with that here. So, there has been this broad zoning change that says that units under 900 square feet can be built as of right in districts zoned for single family. We talked about this a few years ago as one of the tools that we were looking at from other states. So there has been pushback from plenty of communities because the policy change removed a few things, including their right to insist that the ADU be occupied by family members, for instance, or be within a certain distance of transit. But there are other ways that a city or town could still kind of determine what the ADU might look like, that sort of thing. And then mayors of places like Malden and Fall River say that this will essentially overwhelm their systems. And you, of course, were the city manager of Worcester. So how do those objections strike you? What's good faith? What's resistance to housing?
I think one of the things, the way I look at government is we're balancing interests. At the end of the day, if you just boil it down, what are you actually doing? You're trying to balance interests. So certainly nobody wants to or has any incentive to overwhelm communities. But we definitely need and desperately need more housing. And the state cannot subsidize our way. We just don't have enough resources out of this problem. So part of it is we have to change the regulatory environment that lets a property owner make a decision that makes sense to them, that they're going to go to their bank or credit union or, take a home equity loan and build this unit out and maybe bring in some additional income that may allow that homeowner to stay in their home longer. Maybe they retire and their income is fixed. Their insurance goes up, their taxes go up, but they have another source of income from that ADU that may allow them to stay housed longer, or provide that relatively affordable unit in a community where that senior wants to downsize, and then free up that big house for a growing family and create some of the movement in the housing system that we've not seen in recent years. It's trying to strike the balance. We looked at California, we looked at New Hampshire, we looked at other states, and what was their experience when they made some of these changes. And the ones that saw the significant increase in ADUs were the ones that didn't allow things like restricting to family member. Why? Because it's hard to access equity. Because if you're going to bring grandma in to live with you and you're going to count on grandma's Social Security check to kind of pay the debt service on that, but then grandma passes away and you're still paying on that unit, you have no ability to rent to anybody else because it's restricted to a family member. And so we wanted to learn those lessons from other places and create a system that would work, that would allow these to be created. And I think, I look forward to coming back in 5 years and see if Fall River or Malden or any other place has been overwhelmed. I don't believe that'll be the case. I believe that, every couple of streets in any given community, somebody's going to add one. Not everybody's going to want somebody living that close. Not everybody is going to have the financial ability to build these out or just the interest to build these out. So I do think you'll see that we'll gently add these units across the state that help, in many cases, provide more housing opportunities for the DPW worker in those communities that they desperately need to be able to live close to those communities to provide the essential services. So I think it's going to work out in a way that doesn't have some of the scary consequences that some communities might be worried about.
We're going to get into the MBTA communities kind of component of this in just a second. But before we do that, I don't know if everyone else is like me and wants to do nothing but talk about zoning, but this is your opportunity to say, what is another zoning change that you think is kind of adjacent to that ADU shift? What is a change about the way that permitting or zoning can be done that will be another, maybe a single in the context of this?
I don't want to get too ahead of our review of the Unlocking Housing Production Commission report. I chair that, so I'm very much aware of the contents and the debates, but it's, between our team and the governor's team to talk about how and what we might try to implement from that commission report. But I think there are a lot of good ideas in there, things like removing parking minimums. That could be a huge game changer. I've seen this in my Worcester experience where, again, there's always this balancing of interest. If you've got a housing development that may be going into a particular neighborhood, people are worried that it's going to create parking challenges for the neighborhood. And often we see communities that will require more parking to be built than is actually necessary. And it can drive the costs significantly, especially if you're building structured parking. And it really doesn't often advance our climate goals when you have like these big paved surfaces that create runoff and other challenges for, our environmental goals. So I think the idea that we think about, do we need as much parking in every one of these spots, particularly, as we try to do more smart growth and more building of housing close to transit, which of course the MBTA Communities Act is all about, that advances multiple priorities the state has and allows the cost of these developments to be more appropriate to what the actual needs are versus reacting to the community's worries or pushback at a zoning board meeting or a planning board meeting. So I think, we've seen Cambridge really push the envelope recently in some of the things that they've looked at. So I think there are a lot of ideas floating around. There's some specific recommendations in the Unlocking Housing Production report around zoning that we're going to give a real close look at that could, make it easier, more predictable, and more cost-effective to build housing.
And then getting into the MBTA communities. So if somehow this is the first time that anyone listening to the podcast has ever heard about the MBTA Communities Act, this is the law that requires a multifamily zoning district near transit, broadly speaking, in the broadest possible version of it. And this is, once again, maybe, and this might also sound familiar, a little bit on the skids again with some communities because a number of municipalities are suing to delay compliance until the state directly funds the costs associated with rezoning. I would be remiss, do not note that the vast majority of these 177 communities are, in fact, in process toward compliance or in compliance already. So since this is sort of a follow-up on the results from the state auditor determining that the MBTA communities law, so these sort of 3 paragraphs that were passed initially, did not include a required funding component to it, how has the Housing Office thought about the funding aspect of MBTA communities, what it costs to go through the process, and what mechanism makes the most sense for helping them do it?
We've approached it, I think, thinking about the state as a partner with local cities and towns as they try to make the zoning changes required by the law. And we've provided, I think it's $7.8 million of grants that support consultants or other kind of technical assistance that a community might need in order to develop a zoning map that creates the potential for the number of units necessary under the law. And 155 of the 177 communities have received those grants or technical assistance. My understanding is not one community asked for resources that didn't receive resources. So we think that we've been good partners and provided the support necessary to comply with the law. Some communities have just philosophically been opposed to it. I won't speak to all of their motives, but my sense is that no community didn't move forward on their plan because they couldn't access support to develop the plan. They had other objections beyond the technical assistance support.
And a lot of the discussion around things like ADUs or the MBTA Communities Act, which of course does not require any new housing, but a rezoning for the potential of future new housing. Estimates say, maybe 10% of these units that get rezoned are actually going to turn over and actually kind of produce new units in the decade afterward. So I suppose I'm curious on a philosophical front here. Does the housing office feel like it's in a weird position where it's sort of simultaneously saying that this is very important and will do a lot of good while also trying not to oversell the number of units in a way that might cause sticker shock? How are you thinking about that as a former municipal official?
Yeah, and I think one of the things I try to remind folks is, there is a number that you need to zone for. The reality is all the laws of gravity have not been suspended. And so you still have all the challenges we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. That, interest rates are high, cost of materials are high, the marketplace is unpredictable at the moment. All of those are factors, whether you're in an MBTA community zone or somewhere else in the state or in many cases anywhere else in the country. One of the things within our local control is the predictability or not of the zoning. Can you actually build this in this location? We're trying to remove that one variable from the equation, which often is time, because if you don't know you can build it and you've got to go through all sorts of boards and maybe you're ultimately end up in court, you could be spending time, you've got carrying costs for the property that you've acquired to build this housing that were not part of your original pro forma that drive up the cost of housing. So all of those are factors that are controlled for by us, at least dealing with the underlying zoning. The reality is all of these units will not be built out in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years because of the market forces, the ability to actually assemble the property within these zones. But some will. And we've already got 3,700 units in the pipeline from the 119 communities that have already changed their zoning to allow for some of this. Some of the earlier ones, like Lexington, we're seeing a number of units in their MBTA community zone. Grafton, we just gave a Catalyst Fund grant to that's facilitating a walkway from the new units to the MBTA commuter rail stop in Grafton. So it's already working. And that's what we're basically saying. We need to create some housing, and every community needs to do their share, their proportionate share. But I think the financial and market realities are all of these units aren't going to be built out probably ever, but some can be built out over the course of time. And we have a sense of urgency about this because there's a lot of people who are desperately in need of housing or are making decisions to leave Massachusetts because they can't find the appropriate housing.
It seems like that would cause a domino effect, right?
And that is a threat to our economic health and viability. Because if it's a big business that employs a lot of people, or it's your local pizza shop or coffee shop that requires people to live relatively close because you're not making a ton of money, but living relatively close, the median home price is $950,000 and you're working in the coffee shop, it's going to be challenging to do that. And then that business goes away. And that business is part of what makes that community a cool place to live. It also shares the cost of the property taxes in that community, which will be shifted to all the remaining residential taxpayers. So there's a lot of self-interest that we should be looking at this housing crisis. Even if you're housing secure, this housing crisis impacts you, whether it be the threat of keeping businesses and jobs, whether it be the hospital or the nursing home that you or your family count on being able to have workers to provide those essential services when you or your family need them. This housing crisis impacts everybody in Massachusetts, even if you, at this moment, are housing secure.
And I do want to touch, of course, on the various ways that this ends up interacting with other systems here, because the state is struggling with its shelter burden as well. I'd note that the issue has often been associated with immigration strains, but the emergency shelter system supports a wide array of people. Some quick stats. As of last week, there were 5,454 families currently enrolled in the emergency assistance shelter system. About 1,900 of them are staying in hotels and motels. Again, we have unit lacks here. This has cost the state about $520 million so far in fiscal year 2025, and the legislature had to pass a new $425 million supplemental budget last month to fund the program through June. The quick question is that sustainable financially?
Well, I think both the governor and the legislature have acknowledged it's not, and that's why in that $425 million supplemental appropriation, there was some significant policy changes that were part of it that were designed to bring the kind of size of the shelter system and the length of time that families can stay in that shelter system more in line with what the state can afford and what we can safely manage. And, I think those changes, we had a 9-month length of stay prior to this latest change, which is now a 6-month length of stay. And I think we've seen the number of exits, so the families leaving to permanent housing, go up significantly. 18 months ago, last time I was on the podcast, we probably had maybe 100 families exiting. Now we have 700 families exiting. It's partly because we're not dealing with 1,000 families a month as we were at the height of this at the front door, and we can spend more time with the families in the system and how to get them out the back door, again, to a safe and stable housing, which is where the family wants to be, where the Commonwealth wants them to be. And so the whole notion is, how do we make shelter brief, rare, and non-reoccurring? Shelter is not the end goal. It isn't to bring families in and have them stay for long periods of time. It's to bring them in, stabilize them, help them figure out the path and the supports they need to get into a permanent home. And so we're now able to kind of reorient and redesign the system so it helps facilitate that goal, where previously we were just being kind of overwhelmed with the numbers that we were seeing. And through a lot of actions that the governor's taken, support from the legislature, I think we're on the path to have a much more manageable system. We may serve ultimately the same number of families, but we'll do it in quicker, more cost-effective ways. By the end of this year, we'll be out of hotels and motels, which are not only costly, but not really appropriate for families. They're better than being unsheltered, but often there's no kitchenettes. So if you need to heat up a baby bottle or, make breakfast for your family, there's not the ability to do that. And so we've, through the EA Commission work over the summer, kind of identified that as a goal to get out of hotels and motels by the end of the year, and we're on track to do that.
And how do you keep in mind during this entire process, of course, that there is, there's the financial component and then there's the moral component, and the state does have an obligation to provide shelter for specifically pregnant women and then families with children. So how are you balancing those?
Yeah, and that really is primarily the goal of the policy, the law, the right to shelter law that's been in place for 40 plus years. I'm proud to be from a state that doesn't let infants and pregnant moms go unsheltered. Right now at the front door, 75% of the families are Massachusetts families, longtime Massachusetts families. So these are your neighbors. These are the families that your kids go to school with who maybe because of domestic violence or because of a loss of a job or a health crisis find themselves housing insecure and ultimately homeless. And, we're a state that says those kids don't have to live under a bridge someplace, that we will figure out how to get them the supports they need in order to ultimately get them rehoused. So, again, it's been an unprecedented kind of challenge just because of the volume of families that we've been dealing with. But I do think we've got a safer, more manageable, and ultimately a more cost-effective system as a result of some of the recent changes than we had when we started 2 years ago.
And then I guess the last thing is sort of coming back to where we started here, which is we've got this goal, 220,000 units in the next decade or so. A few things have changed since that report started getting underway, namely the presidential administration. What is your level of confidence that that number can be hit? Is that a stretch goal, or is that something that's like realistically achievable under these circumstances?
It won't happen without a lot of work and a lot of effort. We think that the Affordable Homes Act was going to create or preserve about 65,000 units of housing. So that is an important tool in helping us accomplish that goal. As we look at the recommendations of the Unlocking Housing Production Commission, that can further expedite and help create more units of housing. We've got some headwinds, as you mentioned, coming from the federal level that are going to slow us down in some cases and makes units cost more in other cases. And so we're going to have to manage through that. We can only control what we can control at the state level. I use the line all the time. I don't know who originated it, but it's got a lot of sources potentially, but a crisis is a horrible thing to waste. Sometimes when you have a housing crisis or any kind of crisis, you can make changes that a more normal environment wouldn't allow for. Politically would be challenging. I think the ADUs are part of that. I think the MBTA Communities Act is part of that. So we ought to take this moment and offer up bold, creative solutions, things that maybe we've seen work in other places or based on our unique circumstances here in Massachusetts, we think collectively can help us get closer to that 220,000 units over 10 years than we would from just the status quo.
All right. Well, thanks again to Secretary Ed Augustus for joining me on the podcast. Thank you all for listening. I am Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email podcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We will be back in your ears next week.